An honor to have you all over here today as we discuss digital activism for human rights movements. Digitization is one phenomena that has just not quickened the reporting process for mass media but has diluted states' monopoly over narrative building and giving people a significant stake in shaping them, pushing governments and international organizations to act on the whim of the masses more often. Human rights violations are one area where one may no longer be able to completely hamper the facts until the books of history come bearing witness to towers of skulls. In June 2019, when 26-year-old Mohammed Matar was shot dead in Khartoum, little did the world know about the situation in Sudan, where bodies were washing up the Nile. Matar, an engineer by profession and a social media activist, had his favorite shade of blue on his social media profile picture, a blue that soon became the symbol of Sudanese resistance, as people across the world started changing their profile pictures owing to the hashtag #BlueForSudan. The wave intrigued conventional media and the masses as they started looking for the origin of the massive number of blue profiles appearing on their social media feeds, and hence the world was made aware of the atrocities of Sudan's authoritarian regime against its citizens. Though media has been actively reporting on most human rights issues from decades, the collaboration of conventional media with the informal media has played a vital role in speeding up the reporting process as well as providing multifaceted news. Whether it was Syrian immigrants stranded on the shores of Greece and Turkey, Rohingyas of Myanmar pleading for refuge, Sudanese fighting for democracy, or Kashmir deprived of its right to self-determination and silenced forcefully, mass media is strengthening humanitarian causes like never before. As we discuss sustainable development in a digital society, human rights are one area where digitization is doing an enormous service. Movements getting momentum because of digitization are subtly transforming society's inherent justice and reward system, both nationally and internationally. We thus have a very distinguished panel to whom we put some key questions to critically analyze the developments. Questions, some of them are: how is digitization helping resource-poor causes? How significant is the notion of a change in society's attitude towards humanitarian causes due to their increased visibility? And has digitization increased the scope of manipulation and propagation of agendas in guise of social activism? Also, are the challenges posed by cyber activism on to the status quo leading us towards an anarchic system? Today for our session, our chair is Senator Ayesha Raza Farooq. Ms. Ayesha Raza Farooq is a senator since 2015, and formerly she was Prime Minister's focal person on polio eradication, for which in March 2018 she received Sitara Imtiaz from the government of Pakistan for her role in polio eradication. Ma'am, if you will please join us on the stage. Our second panelist for the day is Mr. Meyer. He will be joining us on Skype. He's the Executive Director, Democracy Reporting International, Germany. He's a lawyer with 15 years of work experience in political transitions and democratization. Our second panelist is Dr. Nathalene Reynolds. Dr. Nathalene has a doctorate in the history of international relations, and she has authored 2 books on Kashmir. Dr. Nathalene, please. A third panelist is Ms. Ruwa Shah. She has worked as a journalist in India and is currently studying TV and cinema in Turkey. Ruwa, please. Our fourth panelist is Mr. Saroop Ijaz. Mr. Saroop Ijaz is a lawyer with Human Rights Watch in Pakistan, and he's authored multiple books and is a regular opinionated writer in different newspapers of Pakistan. Sir. We also have Dr. Inshah Malik. Dr. Inshah Malik is assistant professor at Kardan University, Kabul. She's a visiting scholar at Washington University, and she has authored a book, Muslim Women Agency and Resistance in Politics, The Case of Kashmir. Last but certainly not the least is Ms. Nighat. Ms. Nighat is a Pakistani lawyer and an internet activist who runs the non-profit organization Digital Rights Foundation. I'll now hand over the floor to our chair, Senator Ayesha Raza Farooq.
Thank you, Ayesha, and welcome to all the guests who are present here today. A very warm welcome to the very esteemed panelists that SDPI has invited for a very, very important discussion on digital activism and how it has helped human rights movements, not just in Pakistan, but across the world. And what I'm enjoying most sitting here is the number of female panelists that we have here. And Saroop, we generally have the opposite. So it's like a gender discrimination, positive discrimination in favor of women here. So I hope you don't feel very left out there, Saroop. So we will take our first distinguished panelist, Mr. Michael Meyer, who's joining us remotely from Berlin. I hope we have him online. Organizers, do we have him ready online? So we would be very eager to hear from Mr. Michael how digitalization has increased the scope of manipulation and propagation of agendas at times in the guise of social activism. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, distinguished guests, and thank you to the Sustainable Development Policy Institute for the invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Very good. I also turned on my camera, but I don't see any confirmation that that works. But I don't want to take up our time with technical questions, so I think I just go ahead. I like your outline of the agenda and the discussion, in particular because you gave it a positive note. You know, you looked at the promise of digitalization and the spread of information, and I think that's good that you take a positive note. I have been in the last 2-3 years at easily 30 conferences and meetings and workshops on social media, and they were almost all entirely negative, talking about manipulation and all the problems that we have seen in the digital sphere in the last years, and they were all right. But of course, it still remains also a promising space for a lot of human rights work. And I think for any kind of human rights activism, it's very bad to fall into cynicism or into doom and gloom, because there's always something we can do and that's something we can improve. So I'm grateful for this positive framing of the agenda. The promise is clear, I think, and you mentioned it very well in the program, that now the globe can witness what is happening. We can all witness what is happening to people around the world, often in lifetime. And that is a big change to the past. And I would say the challenge of all this is that we have a lot of facts, and we often have facts even in real time. The challenge today is how to translate facts into attention for people. I think if 30 years ago you would be able to get hold of information of a humanitarian disaster or a significant human rights problem somewhere, attention was more or less guaranteed. It isn't anymore today, because information overload is so significant that it's very hard to get attention for anything in particular. And if you get attention, how do you turn that into empathy, that people care? You may look at pictures and say that's bad and then move on. So you have to get more than only attention. You have to turn that into empathy and into understanding also. Empathy alone is not enough. It's understanding, and go from there into activism. I think that's a big challenge generally these days, to make use basically of all the information we have. And another element for me in all this is that I believe, are in a global battle of ideas, and this battle is taking place online largely, a lot in social media, and not only, of course. And this battle in a way decides also how do we deal with facts, how we interpret facts. It becomes more and more polarized today how people actually deal with facts and what they think about facts and what emotions these facts trigger in them. And I'll just give you a little example of an old friend of mine who is by origin and by beliefs a quite conservative person. He's a Catholic, a believer, very respectable person, and I like him a lot. But I could notice how in the last year he moved through online content more and more into the fold of the American alt-right. And, that worried me. And of course, there are things where they can attract somebody who is a conservative, but I believe many things they propagate actually violate his belief systems. And I try to explain that to him, but I see that trend around the world that we are more and more pushed into global schools of thought, and in very basic terms, we are asked to be liberals or conservatives, and I really dislike this kind of polarization. Human opinion is much more colorful than just two camps, especially when we look around the world, and I think this kind of opinion formation is something worrying and something we should push against. And also, if we look at the digital space and activism, I have this concern that a lot of it is a little bit too simple, and you may know the catchword of slacktivism. You put likes or dislikes, or you express your anger, but where does that lead to? Is that more than just a symbolic act? And I think if we look at studies, they find that it does lead to a form of opinion formation, which is good, and politicization, but it doesn't guarantee at all that it's translated into more meaningful activity. And I see that is also a challenge here, that we can go from opinion formation to doing something. So to conclude my little introduction here, I think I would make two overall points. The first is we have to understand that whatever facts we can now expose depend, the impact of that depends on what kind of opinions people have, and opinions are formed online, and we have to understand that. And I'm happy to hear that Nighat from the Pakistan Digital Rights Foundation is also on the panel. We worked a little bit with them. They published a very good report on online campaigning during elections. And I think we need to do a lot on that. And as an organization, we work a lot on that to try to understand the dynamics of opinion formation online and in social media. And from there, of course, you have to go to connect, when you have understood the space, to connect it to action. And my second point is that I think a lot of the debate is a little bit uninstitutional. It often forgets a little bit institutions, and we have a lot of revolts this year in many countries, but a big challenge to turn these revolts into lasting institutions. And I would there focus on two things. The one is the global debate itself is shaped by institutions, and the big tech companies that own these social media spaces. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to that, to understand how it works, to understand the regulatory debate around all that, to influence it. I think that will be essential to basically work more on the roots of what we do with all these texts that now emerge. And the second element, of course, is that we have a global debate, but politics and policy is still made by states. And I would say even more so than 10 years. The role of international institutions has become weaker. States are drifting apart, and we cannot ignore that. So I think we still have to look very much also at our own states, at what they are doing, and try to influence it to support our causes. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you personally. I've been very often to Pakistan. I love traveling to Pakistan, but it was a problem with timing. My colleagues Malik is there, Shahira Siyat, and maybe other colleagues. They're happy, of course, to talk more. I wish you a very good conference, and I look forward to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Meyer, and for your insightful thoughts there. And I think as we listen to other panelists later in today's session, they will be able to elaborate further on the trends that you mentioned of how an information overload out there online does and does not always lead to a meaningful activity, and how the role of states in regulating these platforms becomes very critical. Before we move to our next panelist, if there are any question from the audience for Mr. Michael Meyer, if you could take those right now, because I think it's a little unreasonable to ask him to stay with us over the next 2 hours. So anything particularly, any question for Mr. Meyer, we take that right now. Thank you, Mr. Michael. I think you were very, very crisp, very, very clear. So thank you for joining us remotely from Berlin. Looking forward to having your company some other time. Thank you. And with that, we'd like to...
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. And with that, we'd like to move now to Dr. Nathalene. She has a doctorate in History of International Relations. She's authored 2 books on Kashmir also. Dr. Nathalene, we'd like you to tell us how digitalization has facilitated freedom of both speech and expression, and how thus helped resource-poor causes. And I believe Dr. Nathalene has prepared a presentation for us, and through that she'll hopefully help answer these concerns for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, SDPI. Thank you, Ayesha, for inviting me. If you look at the present situation now, you can see there's a greater polarization in India between people faithful to the Hindu nationalists and the people who are trying to defend what the Kashmiris have been going through since the 5th of August. For my part, I thought it would be interesting to go back to the hanging of Afzal Guru and a concept which was elaborated by the Indian Supreme Court in its judgment, the concept of the collective conscience of a nation. And I'll be, of course, linking it to the area of digital media. There's a very interesting interview done by an Indian journalist working for Kashmir Watch, which is a Brussels-based website, and he went and interviewed Afzal Guru just before Afzal Guru was hanged. As you might remember, Afzal Guru was considered to be the main culprit of the parliament attack of the 13th of December 2001 in New Delhi. And Jose met him in probably one of the worst jails in India, Tihar jail. So Jose asked him a very interesting question when you looked at it from an Indian point of view. He asked about the contradicting image of Afzal, asking which Afzal am I meeting? And Afzal Guru went with his answers to different periods in the history of Azadi in Kashmir, when he was a young, enthusiastic, intelligent, idealistic young man who crossed over to Azad Kashmir, then joined the GKLF and became disillusioned and started trying to have a normal life, but were never allowed by Indian security agencies in Kashmir, and in the end was falsely implicated in a case with no lawyer, no fair trial, and finally condemned to death. And then Afzal Guru goes on saying, the lies the police told was propagated by you in the media. And that perhaps created what the Supreme Court referred to as a collective conscience of the nation. And to satisfy this collective conscience, I'm finally put to death. That's the Afzal Guru we are meeting today. And he's also wondering about the concept of Indian democracy. We have here the honor of having Ruwa Shah, I hope I'm pronouncing properly, who is the granddaughter of Saeed Ali Shah Gilani. And yesterday when we talked, we deferred, because Ruwa is of the opinion that the lack of faith of the Kashmiri in Indian justice started with the hanging, the condemnation of Afzal Guru, where I would be of the opinion that it started much earlier. So Afzal Guru is wondering what the outside world is thinking about all this, asking if justice was done, and if Indian democracy would like to hang a person who didn't even get a fair trial. concluding with democracy doesn't mean that, does it? Then I'm running late, I have to go quicker. There's a very good book, which is in fact a collective book of different articles published by Sanjay Kak, who is a Kashmir Pandit, but whose family left the valley long before the militancy started, and he's been a human rights activist along with Arundhati Roy. And he gives figures about 70,000 Kashmiris being killed, 8,000 have gone officially missing, plus all kind of physical and economic grievances. And then he comes to the question of the mass grave which were found in 2005 after the earthquake, and which an NGO called the International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice started mapping. And because of that, and because Kashmiris were more connected, this NGO was informed that 3 people have been recently killed, buried anonymously, and the person who buried them, a Rashtriya Rifles soldier, claimed the reward, the financial reward, because it has also become a business. So Afzal Guru goes to the fact that people have been fooled in believing that he was a culprit, and in fact nobody knew really what happened on the 13th of December, and also saying that because his family was taken as a scapegoat, he had to confess a crime. He was not responsible, and when he was asked about somebody else and his claim he was innocent, he was shouted at by 2 Indian police officers, and the journalist was told to cut this part of the story. So Afzal Guru had made an appeal to the Indian nation, which was not to allow blind nationalism and mistaken perception to lead you to deny even the most fundamental right of your fellow citizen. Peace comes with justice. If there's no peace, there's no justice. Or if there's no justice, there's no peace, sorry. And then there's the question of, but I'm sure Ruwa would come to that because I'm running out of time, the question of how Makbul Bhatt was hanged in February 1984 at a time where there was no digital media, and what happened in the case of Afzal Guru. Okay. There's a very, so then we come to the question of the judgment of the Supreme Court, which is very, very interesting. When Afzal Guru appealed to the Supreme Court to get a fair judgment, the Supreme Court stated in August 2005, I'd like to read this part because it's very important. The incident which resulted in heavy casualties had shaken the entire nation, and the collective conscience of a society will only be satisfied if the capital punishment is awarded to the offender. And then it comes with a list of concepts saying they were challenged. So the challenge to the unity, integrity, and sovereignty of India by these acts of terrorists and conspirators can only be compensated by giving the maximum punishment to the person who is proved to be the conspirator in this treacherous act. And if you go on YouTube, there's a very interesting kind of cartoon made on media at the time of the hanging, showing how Afzal Guru was a bad guy and how the Indian nation was right in hanging him. Sorry, I forgot to. What do I do? Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with this thing. This I did already, sorry, I didn't show the slide. And then in February 2016, you had an attempt at celebration in JNU of the hanging of Afzal Guru, I mean commemoration, sorry for my English, which was banned by the authority after the Hindu nationalist student wing complained that it was anti-national, and one of the leader of the student wing in JNU, JNU student wing, was accused of sedition. Now I'd like to come to answer the question I was asked, to the question of the stones throwing movement. And the fact that it changed the whole scenario because people were unarmed and started imitating the Palestinian Intifada, giving a new legitimacy to the movement, and showing also that the youngsters were looking for dignity and were ready to die for it. So then came the question of the digital media, when somebody panicked at the top of the hierarchy in the Indian government and banned the SMS service and the internet. And this is how apparently people started using other social networks, Facebook, Twitter, etc., to communicate and to promote their cause worldwide. And Sanjay Kak said that this is how the Kashmiri struggle acquired a new dimension, because instead of speaking to each other, Kashmiris started to talk to the world, which is why also it hasn't been bring any weight politically. But there were quite a lot of not condemnation, because India is a big market, and so nobody would try to, because there's so many money involved. But still, people are starting wondering of this kind of democracy in India and in Kashmir. Thank you very much. I hope I answered the question partially. The situation, as Ruwa will tell us, is dramatic in Kashmir, and I hope there would be more mobilization for to help the Kashmiri people in these circumstances. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Nathalene. And yes, one indeed wonders how different things would have been back in 2013, yes, when Afzal Guru was hanged, and before that, when he was imprisoned, had the platforms of social media, the Facebook, Twitter, and all were available. And like you've so correctly said, that news in Kashmir quickly found another way to move. And Kashmiris started talking to the world through Twitter, through internet, through Facebook, and so forth. And we would now like to invite a very distinguished guest, Ruwa Shah, who's the granddaughter of Mr. Ali Gilani here. And we would like you to share first-hand information that you bring to us on how a societal attitude towards humanitarian causes has changed due to this increased visibility that social media platforms provide us, and especially in the context of Kashmir. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, SDPI, Ayesha, everybody for having me here. I'm not going into the very complexities of the issue because we have all been talking about it for so long now. How many of us in this room do we have access to internet right now? Almost all of us. Can you put yourself in place without internet, like your mobile data is finished for 5 minutes? And can you imagine yourself? No. 5 minutes. A day? A month? It has been 4 months today as we speak. We 8 million people of Indian-occupied Kashmir have been put under a military lockdown with without any sort of communication, being provided to them. In fact, the partial communication that was restored and the narrative that India plays is only one type of postpaid mobile service has been started, which makes no sense actually. And this all happened post August 5, 2019, when the Indian government scrapped the partial autonomy that Indian occupied Kashmir had, and the Article 370 basically, to which, by the way, we had no loyalty if we go into it. And after that, there was nothing, actually there is nothing left in Kashmir. Every basic human right has been taken away, and it is not today. It has been happening for the last 72 years now. I will particularly speak about post scrapping of Article 370 and the implications, as you asked me. What effect does it lay on a society? So when an authoritarian regime bans internet, which is very basic, which is the right of everybody in today's world, it has devastating effects on the entire society. And the scars are so deep, and the aspects to it are so, the entire population becomes vulnerable to a lot of things. It is not, let's not take it only at the face value of it, कि हमारे पास internet नहीं है and now we are not able to access our phones. Education, health, economy, trade, business, I don't know, I can keep on naming and it will not end. Everything is shut in Kashmir for the last 4 months. And it's inhuman. If not inhuman, I don't know what else to call it. And then there is the control of the narrative by the state. Why did they ban the internet? Why was the internet at first place banned? Because they had a lot of things to hide, and they had to present a particular narrative to the world, which, thanks again to being digitized, they did not completely succeed in because of the Kashmiris living outside Kashmir, because of a lot of volunteer movements that happened across the world, and with the support of a few countries, I won't say a lot. And I believe those voluntary movements that happened, protest movements or activism, even diplomatic actions that were taken anywhere in the world, is because of being digitized. I think I give credit to it. But at the same time, look at the challenges one faces when you do all this. Media inside Kashmir is not allowed to report. Journalists are being arrested. 2 journalists were arrested when all of this was happening. And Twitter handles were blocked or suspended. Tweets were taken off Twitter. And this is the influence of a very strong, oppressive, fascist regime. And I have no hesitation in calling it so as of now. So when such control of narrative happens, even within the media, as I said, spoke of the control of the narrative. What does the state do? They tell you half truth, or they tell you the complete lie, and you don't have a counter narrative to it, and you believe it, and that is what is happening with us. The Indian media will tell you that the schools are open, and that is normalcy. They will not tell you that the schools are empty. Nobody is going to those schools. They will tell you that nobody is being killed, but they will not tell you that, they will not give you access to the hospitals. They will not let you talk to the doctors. They will not let you talk to the families. Despite all this, there has been a lot of reporting, and reports have come out of Kashmir that have actually talked about the torture that happened in the past 4 months, the extreme levels of harassment, human rights violations. And I fail to understand, despite all this, it came out, and when it will all open out, like, the Pandora's box will open, what all would we really get to know? Look at the intensity and the magnitude of the situation or the harassment that Kashmir, or the pain that Kashmiris have been inflicted upon. I'm sorry, I was going by the script, but when we talk about Kashmir, you just forget it. And coming to the life, I believe all of us, the entire generation, this generation particularly, we are all going under the extreme stress of living in a conflict. And we go through phases. 90 happened, and then I witnessed firsthand conflict when I was 15 years old in 2008 when Tufail Matu was killed. A 10-year-old boy who just came out from his tuition center killed for nothing. It created anger inside me. And it's not only me, it's all of us who are speaking out today for Kashmir. It is the state, the Indian state is responsible for, inculcating this anger among us, among Kashmiris. We all Kashmiris have faced extreme levels of harassment in terms of living there in the presence of millions of troops, and yet trying to narrate our stories. And that is why I believe that a lot of Kashmiris today choose to become storytellers, as cliched as it might sound to be, but we don't have an option. They have tried their best to shut us up, but can we shut up? I don't think we can. But what do we need now? We need support. As long as we keep talking about it, we need people in all the sectors. I'm not doing activism here. I was asked to speak about being human rights and digitalized age. I don't know, but I couldn't just shut up. I'm sorry. And all of this is because of the anger that is inside me. And imagine the anger inside the people of Kashmir who are, as we speak, under a lockdown, and how it will be channelized and how it will vent out. The implications are really, really dangerous. Do I have some more time? You do. Yeah, thank you. So, but yeah, talking about the international support that we got, I think the biggest success post August 5 was that we have been able to arrange protests at the level of what we saw after August 5 in almost all the major cities of the world, including United States, UK. Name any city, there was a protest held because of being digitalized. Twitter, internet helped us a lot, but who were at the helm of affairs for it were Kashmiris, Kashmiri academicians. There is an online campaign called Stand with Kashmir. They did a lot of work, and many other people. I think every Kashmiri was involved in one way or the other, and we don't have a choice left. That is what we are all are going to do. If the access that we talk about, that India has curbed in Kashmir, the internet or any kind of access has been curbed in Kashmir, it is equally available to us at the same time. You know, when we talk about access, it is available for both the oppressor and the suppressed, and we will try and make use of it as much as we can. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Ruwa. Thank you for those inspiring words there. We salute your bravery, salute the bravery of all the very resilient Kashmiris who are undergoing a very, very difficult period in their history. We see how, where on one hand, digitalization helps highlight, provide visibility to humanitarian crises and humanitarian movements across the world. On the other hand, the huge negative is how at times it is misused to promote authoritarian states narratives here, like the government of India has recently tried to do vis-a-vis the Kashmir issue here. We also see how sometimes social media houses and companies like Twitter and all have taken a bipartisan action by removing tweets that were made or Twitter accounts that talked about or raised the Kashmiri issue on social media platforms. And we'll hear more about that later on in today's session from Nighat, who's a specialist on the subject. I'd now like to invite Mr. Saroop Ijaz, who's a lawyer with the Human Rights Watch. So Saroop, we'd like you to talk about how technology has really fundamentally changed the work of human rights movements in Pakistan and across the world, and at the same time, what are inherent benefits or pitfalls to human rights movements as a result of this digitization, and how most efficiently can we and effectively can we utilize technology to this end?
Thank you, Senator. I thought my role was to be a token male on the panel, but I'm okay. So, in terms of, I mean, the conversation that we've just had, but also in terms of what the question that was put to me on how technology has changed, impacted the human rights movement. I think it has impacted the human rights movement in two obvious and intuitive ways. One is the speed with which the work of human rights can be done. And as a consequence, and related to that, is the scope of human rights work. If we look at the early human rights movements, even before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which were movements, let's say, as the anti-slavery movement, or the women's suffrage movement, or in certain civil rights movement, those were movements which incubated over long periods of time, dealt with historic, long-standing questions, required years, sometimes decades of work. And partly why the human rights movement or the work of human rights could only tackle those issues was that those were the only tools available. There was no way for anyone to know about a massacre, a mass atrocity in another continent, in another city even. So what you had, where you did not have the tools of communication to do that, to not do it real time. So all of your human rights work was done post facto. So similarly, I mean, there's an argument that something like the Holocaust could not happen today, because part of why you could kill 6 million people at that point was that you could shroud all of that in secrecy, and there are people who would live near the train tracks and see trains coming, but there was no way for them to tell someone else in real time that's what's happening. So partly it's the speed of that has changed, and the scope of that has also changed. So human rights movement now can aspire to have the ambition of trying to deal with issues in real time, to do the research, after you hear a story, to try and do the research, put something out that afternoon, talk to the media that evening, have at least the aspiration for that to stop the massacre from happening the next day, which is a fundamental shift, which has changed the business of human rights and the human rights movement in profound ways. What has also happened is the tools that the human rights movement now has on its disposal. I'll give you an example, which is in September 2017, when there were reports that the Burmese army in the Rakhine state in Burma was setting fire to what we now know as an ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims. But there was no way for anyone to get journalists in to the Rakhine state because the country was shut off, closed off. But what could be done, and what was done by Human Rights Watch, was to use satellite imagery, which mapped the route of the Burmese army and mapped how along that route, all villages that were there, the Rohingya Muslim villages, this was set fire to. And we could also prove and talk about how this was the monsoon. So fires don't break out unless they are very deliberately done. So this is inconceivable, let's say even, I would imagine, 10 years ago. And what you would do 10 years ago is wait for that to happen. Wait for the massacre, for ethnic cleansing, for mass forcible displacement to happen. And the similar work has been done on forcible displacement in Tibet or destruction of civilian infrastructure in Syria. And the fact that all of that can happen now in real time changes not only what human rights organization or the human rights movement can work on, not only that speed, but what they can work on, how they can do it in real time, how they can... one other fundamental piece, that's one part of it. The second part of it is what human rights organizations, human rights movement can do with that information. And historically, again, what you would do is the modern incarnation of the human rights movement, international human rights movement, is, let's say, formation of Amnesty International in 1961, where you write letters. If at certain point you started sending delegations who will go post facto, then come back, write a report, send it to a media house, for that to be published, let's say 2 months after the thing has occurred. Whereas now, like everybody else, any human rights organization can tweet, can live tweet, which has happened. One notable example is the Central African Republic, where the fact that it essentially came up on the map, not on the, Central African Republic has always been on the map, I hadn't noticed it, but as to media attention was the fact that there were people who, human rights organizations who tweeted. There's much has been said about Egypt and Tahrir Square and but the idea that is significantly changed how we do the work of human rights, how we make those cases. The response, but now how we deal with human rights, how we deal with digital technology, and the recognition that digital technology is now going to be the means by which human rights will both be exercised and violated is fast coming. There are examples of internet shutdowns, which is, so the states have come up with two primary responses. It's to be reductionist, to information that they don't like. One is, of course, censoring. One is shutting off the internet, using the kill switch. That works at times, but it doesn't work in the long run, unless the state is very sophisticated, and there are some examples of that. It doesn't work in the long run because the state needs the same infrastructure. So if you lock a population down, impose a curfew, and do a kill switch, what that would mean is that you would do the kill switch for the soldiers as well. You'll do the kill switch for the communication network of that authoritarian regime as well. So in that sense, there are ways around it, of course, now, but they're very rare. So the idea is that a complete blanket shutdown of technology is perhaps not, you can't do it indefinitely, because you'll have the same, need the same internet resources, you need the same communication resources, the same cell phone resources, which you want to deny the population. So that's the paradox. But I think what was talked about earlier in a couple of presentations before me was the other way around it, is to bombard that digital space with information of your own, where you're not essentially necessarily censoring it in ways that we understand it to be censoring, but you drown out human rights voices. You drown out activist voices. You drown out dissenting voices. While that is possible, that in that sense, technology is not democratic because of the access of it. The state might have more sophisticated resources to flood the digital space with information. And so in that sense, and I think Nighat perhaps might talk about it, would be more suited to talk about it in detail. What we are seeing at the moment, which is true for Pakistan, which is true for many other countries in the region and around the world, is states struggling to come to terms with the fact that they're no longer gatekeepers of information. But also balancing that with the need to regulate the digital space. So in that sense, what we have now, we have digital, and I'm not saying that human rights organizations have it correct as well at the moment. I think that's how we respond to this challenge would perhaps be the defining moment for the human rights movement, at least in this generation, in this era, is the balance between how do you provide, so I'm not talking specifically only about digital rights, which, as I said, the people in the panel who can talk about that more authoritatively, but how do we place the human rights discussion, the human rights movement in a modern digital environment? How do we balance regulation with free expression? It's generally very simple in an ideal world. You err on the side of free expression up to the point that there is a very, very high threshold. We're seeing that that's not been the case. We're seeing both in the region, we're seeing that around the world, in other parts of Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, where you have the idea of new curbs on digital space, which also brings me to another I think one important point that needs to be made, perhaps the last or the second last one that I'll make, is there are new stakeholders. Traditionally, what the human rights organizations did were they did their research and they made their cases either to the public at large or to the media, essentially, with the objective that that would shame, spur, prompt the government into action. So your primary advocacy target was the government. But now, there are organizations, companies, like Twitter, like Facebook, like, maybe I don't know how big Instagram is, but, Facebook, Twitter, who now exercise controls or powers that traditionally belonged only to the states to regulate what speech is permissible or not. This is very, very new. This wasn't, I don't think, was a consideration in the same to the same extent 10 years ago. And how do we deal with that? How do we deal now with not only, and these are inherently not democratic. That's not how they are built. So unlike authoritarian states who have pretenses of being democratic, etc., this is not the idea. But they find themselves or have created an infrastructure where they are now in a position which was primarily, formally, exclusively belonged to states, which is to chill speech, which is to make the distinction of what speech is permissible and what's not. And then we have organizations, digital rights organizations, we have organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, all other major international human rights organizations, who now deal often with these governments, these companies, in the same way that they deal with governments, which is you make your case to them. And I mean, on the fake news bit, I think there's much to be said, but I'll perhaps, in the interest of time, leave that aside for the moment. But as I said, I mean, I'll give you one example of how there's greater transparency, but there's, I mean, how unpredictable all of this is. Last year, the locations of many US secret military bases were given away and made it to the public domain by Fitbit, which is, some of you might be aware of it, which is a health band that you wear on your wrist and is synced to your phone. And that is, of course, how you regulate how many steps you take, how many calories you burn. And there was a social media platform for these fitness apps called Strava, I think. And what was happening was, in the middle of nowhere, you would have people using Fitbit, essentially, and how they would be using it is they would run around that base. Because, I mean, imagine if your base is in a desert, that's the only way you... So they were not only giving away locations, they were actually, and then they were being uploaded. And Strava at some point decided to make it public. And then it got people, and it gave, I think, French troops in Nigeria, US military bases all around the world, where in the middle of the desert you have 200 Fitbit users in, let's say, for want of a better word, in a low-income country where it doesn't make sense, where the nearest town is 20 kilometers away, but you have a settlement of people who use Fitbit and iPhones. And that led to sort of, in this case, it led to greater transparency. In certain other cases, that could be, it could endanger people. So the idea, I think, for the human rights movement, how it responds to the challenge, I'm only talking about digital technology because the other technological challenges which the human rights movement is dealing with at the moment is trying to, which I'll only speak very briefly but they're related to technology, which is ideas like the killer robots, which are almost drones, which will become fully autonomous. And there's now a campaign to have them banned preemptively. And in a sense, one of the first digital campaign that international human rights movement did in recent years was an email campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines, which resulted in a Nobel Prize. So there are other technological dimensions which some of them, I mean, you've seen on WhatsApp, and some of them are sort of, terrifying, and I don't know how true they are. But on killer robots, etc., the idea, there are other technological questions which the human rights movement, like society and ethical and political and legal regimes, will have to answer. But in a nutshell, technology as we found it is, I mean, in many cases, it has been a democratic force, digital technology. As I said, it is manipulated every day by states flooding it by information. But circling back to the example that I gave of something like the Holocaust, something like, shutting down internet probably is, and hence we have greater fear now of anything when you shut down internet, when you shut down phone service. We now, our experience from history, but particularly from the 20th century, is that sort of secrecy, that sort of isolation, that sort of cutting off people has led to and enabled mass atrocities. It would be much more difficult today for that to happen. But as I said, so in that sense, the human rights movement, the work of human rights organizations, be it the communication work of Twitter, Facebook, becoming publishers themselves, not waiting for a newspaper tomorrow to publish it through your press release and just tweet or send out a video. But also now to use technology which is open source. I mean, essentially, it doesn't require a human rights organization to have satellites or any gadgets. It is to have people who can read, mine that information, has been profound. But I don't think, like the rest of society and states and the legal and ethical frameworks, the human rights movement has gotten an answer to that. These are tools which, as I said, it's how we deal with that will decide the fate, the legacy of the human rights movement in this generation, because they are the primary tools for exercising human rights and, paradoxically, for violating them. I'll leave it at that. I also have a threatening chit. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Saroop. It is quite difficult to get a lawyer to conclude his argument. We had to send a couple of notes, but yes, I must appreciate your intervention. I learned a lot. And of course, human rights movement and digitalization, they're going through a challenging period. I think it will take some time for the balance that you're talking about here between free speech, freedom of speech, and regulation. The paradoxes that you have highlighted here. On one hand, how human rights movements gain more visibility, greater traction through platforms, social media platforms here, and greater digitization. On the other hand, how human rights are threatened when state narratives are pushed. You've spoken of the kill switch here, and how it can work both ways in promoting the state's narrative, but on the other hand, hindering sending their own message across. We would like now to invite our next panelist, Ms. Inshah Malik, who's a visiting scholar at Washington University. She has done a lot of work on the politicization and manipulation of digital media, and how dangers of propaganda technology can harm civil rights and human rights movements, and especially within the Kashmir context. Over to you, Inshah.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's an honor to be here and speak to a wonderful gathering. I will basically try to problematize what we have said in really big words. So to begin with, I want to just look at what do we really mean by digital society. When we discuss the word or the framework of digital society, we are basically talking about an advanced technology that actually enables us to speak in a certain language. So in some sense, language itself, the way we speak in the ordinary language, whatever our mother tongues are, basically we trace them back to the Sumerians in modern Iraq, right? Who gave us language. So with language comes a possibility of interaction. And technology has further complicated these aspects of how we communicate with each other. And especially when it has become digital, we have not been able to just trace what a single individual is saying, but we have also been able to trace what people in collectives are thinking, what they are interacting about, what are the issues they are bringing to the forth. And then when such a space is created, we are also creating a huge and massive monopolization and corporatization of digital media, which means there are only a certain number of corporations who can control how the interactions actually play out. So I have been to a few other panels where we discussed how governments are in, basically a ban on, and in the situations of where human rights violations are concerned, and how digital platforms have actually become useful mechanisms for bringing out the voices of oppressed people in South Asia. And may I say, in South Asia, we have a lot of oppressed issues, and Kashmir being predominantly one that I have studied and understood over the years. And I have understood that people have been especially fast in accessing the potential of digital media and exploiting it in the favor of enhancing and emboldening political and social rights of Kashmiri people. So this is just one, per se, you can say, one good example of how people in South Asia could use digital media to enhance the issues of social and political relevance to our collective well-being in South Asia. At the same time, what we have seen is, since 2008, as Ruwa Shah has rightly mentioned, we see a lot of Kashmiris access internet, and the percentages that we have talked about are sort of emboldened very suddenly. So it's 15 million population, of which 5 million are active internet users, which is a huge population of internet users, perhaps the highest in the entire South Asia. And with that attendant high rate of participation in digital media also comes another demographic which is important to understand. It's Kashmir's 75% literacy rate, where you have people who are mostly concentrated in a particular area which has been economically better off than many of the North Indian states. Even today, despite a 60-year-old conflict, Kashmir fares better on many human development indicators than a lot of northern states in India, and perhaps in Pakistan as well. Despite that, the problem has remained that the access to internet has complicated the colonial practices that are otherwise prevalent in our governance systems, in our political systems around different countries in South Asia. And therefore, the kill switch, for instance, has been seen as the only option if a large portion of people are coming and dissenting against a political structure or establishment. But this doesn't actually stop just here. If you pay attention furthermore, you see recently on the behest or the request of Indian government, Twitter removed over 1 million Kashmiri users from its platform, just like that, right? So no framework of what violations they have committed, how do they not meet the community standards. And if you criticize very legally even, which is approved through approved legal mechanisms, you kind of criticize or dissent against how the governments in South Asia perform, you are more likely to be said that you are violating some or the other community standards, which means they're very much capable of throwing you out from such platforms. So this actually raises a bigger issue than what Ruwa has pointed out, which is not just governmental control of digital media, but corporate control of digital media, which means governments are actually incapable to do anything in the presence of corporate medias like Facebook and Twitter, which are global corporations and have their own interests on which government they would succumb to and which government they won't. Right? So they're more likely to accept India's requests or Israel's requests. Probably, the whole idea of allyship and having a sort of a block in the Cold War sense, they might actually influence the policies of how they would accept the request of a particular government. But at the same time, they have also come under fire by United States, for instance, for accepting a lot of requests from the Chinese government. And we know why they are accepting these requests from Chinese government now is because China does present itself as an alternative economic option, right, as an economic power. But at the same time, what is the fate of smaller South Asian nations within the digital society then, if we're not able to either regulate the access of ordinary people, or at the same time allow for a free and an accessible conversation to happen about social political rights of people who are still by far marginalized by the international standards. Now coming back to, and I don't want to really go on and on because the theorization part of it is really expansive, but I would like to point out that when you go back to the context of Kashmir, you basically see from 2008 onwards, when we have the first non-violent kind of movement started by a new generation of Kashmiris who are demanding security of their land rights through the Amarnath land row. I think many of you must be aware of that. Since 2008, what we have seen is a massive engagement by Kashmiris online trying to bring out issues that are concerning their everyday political life. So the issues are mostly about land rights, the rights of children, political rights of prisoners, the rights of women especially, and most predominantly about militarization as well, like speaking about the dense militarization of Kashmir, and of course ultimately the right to self-determination as well. So these have been the issues that have been regularly flagged on the online media campaigns, and especially with in the latest revocation of Article 370 of Indian Constitution that has led to the annexation of Jammu and Kashmir, the state that was formed through Amritsar Treaty between the British and the Dogra kings. So through such revocation, what we have seen is this complete culmination of political rights of Kashmiris, and also what I like to call dehumanization of Kashmiris, where we do not have to think of Kashmiris as people anymore, where all of their rights could be suspended, and of course the internet or their right or access or their access to actually to be able to express how they feel and what they do and their everyday issues, they could be easily sidelined. And then what is even more dangerous then is to see how global powers kind of come together and accept such dehumanization as a direct outcome of technological advance, by saying, well, Facebook does have liability to the government of India, so it doesn't matter whether there is any framework through which we can say who is a terrorist or not, who is violating any country's laws or not, whether the cases are really legal or not. So purely because there is an agreement that we could call anybody a terrorist anyway, and we could basically kick out millions of people from the digital space, it's alarming because it is not going to stop at Kashmir. This is going to come for every other community as well if the nexus continues to be formed and the corporatization of digital media is allowed, so far and so forth. And what do I actually propose as a response to this is to think of alternative open source medias, especially Fediverse or Mastodon, which argue for open access services such as social medias, where the control is not with anyone, not with any particular government. Now, of course, the question then comes, and I'm sure Senator is also thinking about that, if nobody controls it, how do we regulate it? I think security and policing are still doable in an open source platform as well, just as we are doing policing and security in our everyday real world. For that, we do not have to own a software. And the more we focus on those issues, the better we can vouch for or even enhance or embolden human rights movements in South Asia, because that is absolutely what we need to improve the political and social rights of people in this region. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Inshah. Malik there, I think you've added a new dimension here to digitalization and human rights movements here by bringing to the table the aspect of how not only are human rights globally a matter of convenience, but even access to digital spaces is controlled by the global powers and really is at the mercy of capitalism over here, and it becomes a matter of economics of what is allowed to circulate on digital media and digital platforms or not, and thus the question of looking at open spaces and the regulatory framework over here. And I think that's very interesting, and I think very aptly our next speaker is who we hope will continue and conclude this discussion for us is Nighat. I don't need to think she needs introduction here in Pakistan. She's a lawyer, a very famous, popular internet activist who's the founder of Digital Rights Foundation. Nighat, over to you, please, to talk about how the issues we've raised about social media, how it sensitized people on human rights violations in Pakistan, and some issues that have been raised by Inshah on how free, apparently we thought digital space, which was free, is not as free as we think it is.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's okay if I can sit here and talk, because people who go there, they talk so longer. So it's better to sit here. I'm looking at you, Saroop. But I think, first of all, Ruwa, thanks for your courage and strength, and the way Kashmiris are dealing with the longer internet shutdown against millions of people. And you actually raised very correctly that how there is a bias when we look at the companies, the tech giants, and also the democracies and developed world who are not raising any eyebrows against the so-called democracy in South Asia. One thing that we have been doing since the Kashmiris inside the Kashmir have no access to internet, we are working with the Kashmiris outside, especially in US, and you raised the question about suspension of Twitter accounts and suspension of Facebook accounts, and this is something that we have raised with the company because there is clear bias there. And when we talk about their community guidelines, and as Inshah mentioned, that what is the definition of terrorist, in their dictionary, I think these are the questions that we are posing to them massively, not just us, but several digital rights organizations around the world, holding them accountable, not only the governments, but these companies also. So yes, the question about what these companies are doing is actually everyone is struggling and trying to hold them accountable. But there's several things I think that we need to see when we are talking about human rights movements in the digital age. And I think the question is that, are we just like talking about these movements in the digital age solely, or is it like part of the larger international law? And I think we really, really need to look into the international law, like your Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Your Article 20 talks about the right to freedom of assembly and association. Similarly, ICCPR talks about, this Article 21 talks about that. Our constitution in Pakistan, Article 16, talks about the right to freedom of assembly and association. And I think the challenge that we are seeing in different countries, especially the developing countries, that we are unable to connect the online and offline freedoms. So the laws that we use are mainly to regulate offline spaces, or the freedoms that we have, those are related to our physical spaces. But the challenge that we are seeing is that our courts, our judicial system, our lawyers, our activists, our human rights organization are unable to, or to unable to realize that same rights that people are supposed to enjoy in the physical space, they are supposed to enjoy in the online space similarly. And that's where we are seeing the interventions of United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, David Kai, who has released his report on right to freedom of expression in the online spaces and internet freedom. This June, we have seen the report of UNSR on the right to freedom of assembly and association, and he also talked about that people have this freedom in the online space as well. Similarly, they have the same freedoms in the offline space. And I think governments around the world are struggling to accept this, that people have the similar right the way they have in the offline space, so offline and online. So I think it's very intersectional when we talk about these freedoms. What we are seeing that instead of looking into interpreting our constitution or the laws that we already have for the online freedoms, we are seeing the massive enactment of regulations in different countries. Pakistan is also one of the countries which introduced Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act in 2016, and although it was to deal with the cyber crimes in the online space, but what we are seeing is that the law is being misused against the political descendants or journalists, or because like even people don't even know like what the law says. There was no awareness. The regulatory body doesn't know what to censor. And by the way, internet shutdowns are not just restricted to the Kashmir or to the, of course, the Kashmir is a massive issue, but we have seen internet shutdowns in Pakistan. How many of you have, do you remember the YouTube blocking in Pakistan? Yes. Remember that? How many years? 3 years. And nobody, you know, like, nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew how to question the platform, the Google. Nobody knew how to ask your government to speak to the Google. And to be very honest, I really discourage that we encourage governments to speak to these companies, because the more they speak to these companies, the more suppression we see in terms of policies. So I think the internet shutdowns are very common here also around the world. Wherever states see that there is a peaceful assembly or association in the offline space, we have seen mobile internet shutdown. You must have witnessed this in Islamabad in the name of national security, right? Or security. And all day long, you don't have access to mobile network, internet, and then what do? How do you reach out to your loved ones? How do you reach out to the services that we need? And I think these are the questions we really need to ask, because there is absolutely no accountability. We cannot ask the government that why there is these massive shutdowns happening. And then we have far from areas like students reach out to us from FATA. There is no access to internet there. It's completely blocked. Why it is blocked there? Nobody answers this question. So I think these are the questions we also need to ask us, that what we are doing as a state, we are a democratic state, the regulations that we are enacting in terms of regulating the online space, those regulations need to be, you know, democratic, and the human rights should be the center of these legislations while we make them, because at the moment, the stakeholders, the civil society, the people who have stakes, who are the internet users, have absolutely no say while these regulations are being made. And I hope that there will be questions around propaganda and manipulation of internet that we see every day here.
Thank you. Thank you, Nighat. I think that's very pertinent here while we are sitting here and we're pointing fingers at other governments, countries around the world. Certainly, I think as citizens, I see a lot of young faces here. The youth, 60% are below 30 years of age in our country. I think you need to speak up, you know, use your voice on social media and otherwise to question governments, to question the legislation. As Nighat has just pointed out, there's serious questions regarding whether it's democratic or not and actually serves the purpose it is intended to serve here or not. But it seems from all this discussion that this will go on for a while. And these, whether it's regulation, whether it's the use of technology correctly, properly, for raising a greater visibility around human rights violations, is going to evolve and hopefully evolve positively here and is used for the right purposes. And I hope enough pressure is mounted, not just internally, nationally, but internationally, for there to be less curbs, for there to be less shutdowns, and the term Saroop used, the kill switch is used as little as possible over here. So I think SDPI, you must thank SDPI for providing us this forum, this platform to get all of you together, the distinguished panelists, all of you in the audience, to talk about an issue as important as digital technology and human rights movements here. We cannot end this discussion without making use of the very, very eminent Mr. Rehman, a very prominent peace and human rights advocate here. He's a director of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan for many years, the founder of, the chief editor of Daily Times, the protege of Faiz Ahmed Faiz. The list goes on and on and on. So, sir, we'd be very, very pleased and honored if you could join us on stage here for a few minutes of your concluding remarks, feedback, comments on today's discussion.
Thank you very much. I am greatly honored by the gesture that you have extended me. And I am very heartened to have been listening to you. I can describe a young talent, combination of scholarship and activism. And I congratulate you on the presentation that you have made. See, I'm an old man, so I have done my bit. But what does digital society mean for human rights movement? In human rights movement, the three key words are information, response, mobilization. So, as compared to other avenues that we had, radio, television, audio, visual and all that, digital system makes everything act faster. You can get information fast, you can respond to it fast, you can mobilize. There was a time when if we wanted to have 1,000 signatures on a petition, it would take several days. Now you can take 100,000 signatures on a petition in a matter of minutes. So that is that's the potential. That is the possibility. But all of you have been saying but. I'll tell you a small story if you have time. Some years ago I went to Nepal to study the human rights situation there. So first I went to the office of the Prime Minister, a shabby looking room, no chairs, no sofas, no carpet, not even a typewriter. From there we went to the office of the Commander-in-Chief. And there everything modern. Internet was there, and the latest technique of communication was there, and they were giving us figures and everything. So, unfortunately, such imbalances exist in other countries also, and between nations. We have been mentioning global situation and capital situation. They can block you. I was listening to this wonderful presentation on what is happening in Kashmir. We don't know what is happening there, because all means of communication have been cut off and blocked. So, and this is the great danger, that as technology improves and makes things easier for us, it also makes things easier for those who oppress us. And so the real challenge is how to not only survive, how to beat that system. And I hope we can beat the system, because the more the oppressors use these methods, the more desperate they become. And the more desperate they become, the more likely to stumble they are. Therefore, if we keep our convictions right and decide that we will not be bamboozled into surrender only by their tactics. I don't have to elaborate, you know all of these, how things are and have not done. But the thing is that if we go on using the technology that is available to us, unfortunately, we are an underdeveloped society, and we did not have the capacity to use the earlier systems either. We didn't make use of the radio, we didn't make use of a visual system, we couldn't, we didn't have the means. So we are at a disadvantage in the digital society as well. The only thing is that if they block one block, we create 10 more. That's the only answer. That's the only answer that we can survive and fight our way out of the whole situation by making it a mass movement and not limiting it to a few things. So I think that's all I have to say. I again thank you for the great honor you have done me. You see? But I will advise you not to listen to old people. Yeah. They have created a lot of mess. Take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rehman Saab. Always a pleasure listening to your wise words, your learning from your experience of all these years. We would now like to open the house for a question and answer session here. We have roughly 25 minutes. So please direct your question specifically to the panelist. And do we have anyone with the mic here in the audience? Okay. Yes, so you could please raise your hands and we will take your questions. Needs to break the ice here. Come on. Okay, we have some young gentlemen there, and then, yeah, two young gentlemen. I request you to introduce yourself before you ask your question.
My name is Ahmed bin Qasim. I come from Indian administered Kashmir. So my question is to the lady sitting in the middle actually. I think she's well versed about the technicalities of the topic that we are talking about today. So when we talk about the conflict in Kashmir, I mean, we all know about the internet ban that has been in place for the past 4 months or so. So now the Kashmiris who are living outside Kashmir at the moment, like I'm the son of 2 political prisoners in Kashmir. So when I talked about my mother on Twitter, my account was brought down. I mean, there was no law that I was violating. There was no racism or any sort of abuse that I was involved in. So my account was brought down anyway, and it was withheld in India. So now my people in Kashmir, because unfortunately we are considered a part of India right now, even they cannot see what I write. So then I had to make another account, and then that was brought down too. So when we talk about the legal aspects of it, I want to ask you how considerable that is, because the accounts that have talked about Kashmir are being brought down illegally and without any sense of law or order involved in it. So, and who do we turn to more importantly? You talk about Twitter, we mail Twitter, 1,000 times they don't respond. They don't feel like responding to it. So I don't know how free social media is actually, and I want you to enlighten me about it.
So, unfortunately, I also don't have answer to that, because we all have been talking about, the way these social media companies work, and I think one thing that we have also realized that we don't have more voices of Kashmiris in the digital rights community globally, and I have been looking for lots of Kashmiris who can actually talk about digital security, because lots of Kashmiris, when they use online spaces, they face malware attacks, like they are sophisticated softwares, and you must have heard about NSO. But we are unable to find those Kashmiris. So and it's also, it seems very unfair to me or to some other activists who actually are not aware of the situation and how they can raise this with the relevant people. With social media companies, yes, there is a bias, and that's what I have been saying. And we have raised this with Twitter, we have raised this with Facebook, and we don't know how they interpret the terminologies like terrorist. They are not transparent. Even in Pakistan, when they release reports, like Facebook just released report where Pakistan is the second most country after US, where the government has asked for data and Facebook has complied to it. And there is absolutely no transparency around that. So I think, I don't know, we have no, and that's where, we talk about this like UN mechanisms, because these UNSRs are trying to hold these companies accountable. We have UN Business and Human Rights Council. There are lots of people who are talking about this and trying to hold these companies accountable, but there is not enough voice from our region, and I think that's where we are missing, because Mark Zuckerberg can go to the US Congress and the Congress people can ask him question. We cannot do that. They are based there, they are registered in US. Same goes for Twitter, same goes for Google. And I think that's where the helplessness comes in, where you are like, all right, who we can reach out to? There is no legislation, there is no regulatory body, and I think we need more voices, we need more digital rights activists, and we need to really grow our community where we can, stand as one front from South Asian region. I'm invited to the GORA's conferences as a token brown feminist who can understand technology and sit in the panel and talk about it. And then that's where my perspective comes in. But where we do stand as South Asia region, we have no one voice, to be very honest. When we question these companies, why they would hear us? We are not really stronger in the digital security and digital rights community. So I as an activist, digital rights activist, see that we need to have more people from Kashmir who can be, who can tell their stories instead of me telling their story to these companies.
Thank you.